Right. Seems like everybody's made their way. What a great blessing it was. All those kids this morning when we were beginning, I stood up here and looked out. Again, they never bother me making noise. I can't really, I hear them, but I don't pay attention to them. Probably more of the movement than I am of the noise. But looked out, what a good bunch of kids, especially here towards the front. So good to see some of them out here. So I think they've all made their way into classes and things. So we'll be looking here now in James chapter 5. James chapter 5, verses 7 through 12 is where we're going to end up. Lord willing, we should conclude James here in the next couple of Sundays. I think I've got it timed out to where we should be able to finish James, and then Tom will come and speak to us there about the Tennessee Children's Home. So I kind of told him, I said, if April 6th will work for you, I'll be done teaching what I'm teaching, and then that'll kind of give us a little break from that. And then, Lord willing, again, we'll go into 1 Peter is where my thoughts are to go toward anyway, kind of making some preparations for that. We'll go into 1 Peter, and we'll start looking at that. Again, 1 Peter's they're all great books, right? Whatever we're studying, right? James is a great book, but 1 Peter is a great book because Peter is going to be talking to Christians who are persecuted in 1 Peter from people who are persecuted from the outside, and then in 2 Peter from people who are persecuted from the inside. So when we go through that, it's a great study, again, thinking about what all those Christians, we're going to talk about that here in just a moment, about what Christians had to go through in the first century, when we noticed that, so what they were able to do. So I'm looking forward to that study and that time with you as well. All right, James chapter 5. So we've been looking at the warning against presumptuous boasting, and today we're going to be notice to be patient until the Lord's return. Again, this is going to be, it's really kind of 7 through 11. 12 possibly could be added in. I kept it in there. 12 is going to kind of be interjected in there, it seems like, but kind of towards the end of the letters, what you'll kind of notice is there's a lot of, he's kind of buttoning up what we would say in Tennessee, a few things, and he's kind of making some shorter statements in here. So that's kind of why we've gone from long sections covering many verses to covering just a few verses here towards the end. But we're going to be noticing being patient until the Lord's return. So we're going to have here in chapter 7, or verse 7, be patient therefore, brethren, unto the coming of the Lord. Behold, the husbandman waiteth for the precious fruit of the earth, and hath long patience for it, until he receives the early and the later rain, or latter rain. So when we're looking at this idea of being patient, it's kind of coming off of the heels of the previous, I think I had that in there. Let me look. No. I'm bad I take my notes and I try to pull the points that I want to make and put them on the PowerPoint. Sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. But from the previous verses, what we've looked at is that the oppressed poor are being swindled in a sense from rich individuals, from rich people out of the world, the people who are defrauding them, and they're taking advantage of them, taking away from their money, and these Christians. Again, that's how I view these statements. Is that he's talking to not so much the rich Christians oppressing other Christians, but the Christians that are working for these individuals, and they are oppressed. And we say, how do they handle that? So now in verse 7, he's going to tell them to be patient. So that's kind of difficult for us sometimes in the sense that we do not want to be looking at that. But what I have up here, notice the two different views, or the two different Greek words for patience. So the first one being the one that we're going to, the bottom patience that we see there, the Greek strong number 3114, that's the Greek word that is used here. So what he's saying is to remain tranquil while waiting, have patience, and wait. So for these Christians, as they're being oppressed, they are to be patient in the sense that they are to remain calm in their waiting. Now, you might be reminded back into James chapter 1 when we talked about in verse 3, knowing this, that trying of your faith worketh patience, but that patience is the top patience, the Greek strong word or number there being 5281, the capacity to hold out or bear up in the face of difficulty. Patience, endurance, fortitude, steadfastness, and preservation or preservance. perseverance. Sorry, my glasses, or just my bad way I can read. Anyway, nonetheless, we have there two different types of patience. So again, it's not so much that we're being patient under these tribulations like in James 1. The patience here is more to just remain calm, and I think that's going to kind of fold over into these next few verses. Try to remain calm while you're being oppressed. Now, that's hard for us to do, right? Sometimes I know I was talking to a buddy the other day, and sometimes you let that stuff roll off your back. Just sometimes it just stops rolling, and you kind of want to stand up there in a sense. But that's the case. So be patient. Now, what James uses is, and we're going to get into this coming of the Lord here in just a moment. But he says, "Be patient, brethren, Christians, unto the coming of the Lord. Behold," and he's going to use this example, the husbandman, or a farmer today, we don't really use the word husbandman anymore, "waiteth for the precious fruit of the earth, and hath long patience for it, until he receiveth the early and the latter rain." So he uses this example that even a farmer, right, and sometimes we have to look at this when you disc up your ground and you plant your seed. I know Clarence and I were talking about that this morning, the idea of getting ready to plant that, but you have to be patient, right? You can't expect it just to happen all at once. And sometimes when we were being oppressed, or these individuals were being oppressed, they were like, "Hurry up, right? Hurry up and take vengeance on me, Lord," or "Hurry up and let something happen." And what we find is he's saying you need to be patient, right? Just like a farmer. You can't rush those things. Again, the coming of the Lord. You can't rush this. So again, we're noticing there that they just have to be patient when these things are happening, and they can just sit back, remain calm. All of this is going to happen. Now again, because he's saying don't get all wound up, is because what we're going to see here in just a few verses about being into the same kind of condemnation as them, but they want to remain calm. Now Paul speaks about in 2 Thessalonians. If you have your Bibles, you want to flip over there. 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. Notice some of the similar language that Paul gives. Let's see if I've got it. No, I don't have it up there. 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, beginning there in verse 3, "We are bound to thank God always for you, brethren, as it is meet because of your faith growing exceedingly, and the charity of every one of you all toward each other aboundeth, so that we ourselves glory in you in the churches of God for your patience." Notice, "and faith in all your persecutions and tribulations that ye endure." So the Thessalonians, and that's really what Thessalonians is about. Many people begin to pull out from Thessalonians, and they begin to talk about, this is a lot where they get the rapture, that God's going to call his together, meet him in the air. But that's not what he's talking about. He's discussing the idea that to be patient through this, that Christ is going to come. All right? So again, as you kind of read through that in 2 Thessalonians, he's kind of seeing this. And again, verse 7, notice, "And to you who are troubled, rest with us when the Lord Jesus shall be revealed from heaven with his mighty angels, in flaming fire, taking vengeance on them that know not God and that obey not the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, who shall be punished with everlasting destruction from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his power." So if you're a Christian and you're being oppressed by someone who's not a Christian, right, what are you thinking? Lord, come back, right? Because I know that when the Lord comes back, vengeance is going to be God's, and that these evil people will get what's coming to them, and I'll be, in heaven, I'll be in paradise there, or be in heaven. So hurry up and get here. And that's kind of essentially what James is kind of trying to reassure these Christians here in James. Be patient until the Lord's are coming. Jesus is going to return. Just be patient, right? It can't all happen all at once. Just a note on that idea of the early and latter rain. That's interesting because their growing seasons are different from us. The early rain would come in October. Soon after and about the time of the fall sowing, so they would fall during the sowed during the fall, and which provided the necessary moisture for the grain to germinate. The latter rain fell around March, and which caused the grain to fill out and ripen. That's Brother Woods making that comment there on the early and latter rain. So God provides both of those. You see kind of that in Scripture, the early and latter rain. But God gives all of that for those. But just be patient, right? Be patient like the farmer. Now notice what's going to happen here as we're trying to be patient. Now in verse 8, "But ye also patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord draweth nigh." So this idea of establishing or being established, probably what some of your newer English versions would have is establish, to cause to be inwardly firm or committed, confirm, establish, strengthen. So within yourself, and again that heart, cardia, not talking about the muscle there, but the emotions, the wishes and the desires so deep within me, right? My heart's desire, we kind of talk about that, right? My heart, establish that Jesus is going to return, right? There's going to be the end of the world, that people who are evil will get what's coming to them, and the righteous will get what is coming to them as well, right? That reward. So let's stop for a moment here, and let's make sure we can understand this. What is referred to as the coming of the Lord? So we're seeing this, be patient in verse 7 until the coming of the Lord. Verse 8, for the coming of the Lord draweth nigh. Now, there's some mixed ideas of what this is. If you don't agree with me, as always, don't worry about it. Talk to me about it. Maybe I'm wrong in this. But many people will look at this and say that it's not Jesus' final return. You can really get into some dangerous waters in this, so be careful with some of these ideas. But some look at it as the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 as a type of Christ's return figuratively. And I don't really get behind that. I understand what they're saying is that when the Romans came and destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70, yes, in a sense it was a punishment for the Jews, but I don't think this is what James is talking about, and I'll kind of give you the reasons why. James was written around 40 to 65 AD. So again, he doesn't use the term Christian. He uses to the 12 tribes scattered abroad. But he's not talking about the destruction of Jerusalem or anything like that. So many look at it around 65. So now, if you held to that view that James was written in 65 AD, and James is saying the coming of the Lord is at hand, it draweth nigh, and that being the destruction of Jerusalem, then those line up. But I think that's kind of reaching out there. But there's a lot of men a lot smarter than me that say that maybe that's what what James is referring to. I don't think that's the case. Many will look at that and say, well, because he is saying that the Lord draweth nigh, or that he's coming soon, they can't be talking about Christ's return, because that would be 2,000 years, right? We're 2,000 years removed from that almost, and Christ hasn't returned. But I believe that that's still what they're talking about, James is talking about. I believe James is still speaking about the coming of Jesus, right? When Jesus returns, because James didn't know when Christ was going to return. The Christians there did not know when Christ was going to return. And it just seems like, again, I've got that destruction of Jerusalem's AD 70, but it seems like that would be far removed from these Christians at this time. Because if they were worried about the destruction of Jerusalem. So let me show you this map. There's kind of a lot going on here. I don't know if you can see that light either. All right, so Jerusalem is going to be way down here in this corner. Here's Palestine, or Canaan land, right? Palestine, right around in this area. For those on Wednesday nights, you've been watching these maps. But notice when Paul goes out to do his missionary work, you have all of these churches that are spread out, right? So here's the 7 churches of Asia Minor, when we read about in Revelation, and then when you're reading about Philippi, Ephesus, when we were reading in Ephesians, here's these Christians. Corinth is way over here around Greece, Macedonia. So this is why I do not think that James is speaking about the destruction of Jerusalem, because if these are Christians that are scattered abroad in all of these churches, they're not really concerned with Jerusalem. Why? Jerusalem was where the temple of God was. But as we spoke about this morning in Ephesians 2, we don't go to Jerusalem. We don't go to the temple, right? It was not that big of a deal. It was to the Jews. But for the Christian who was living over here in Corinth, it didn't mean as much with the temple being destroyed as it would have the Jews. And according to Josephus, the Christians got out of Jerusalem. So when you go to Matthew 24 and you're looking at when he says, when you see all these things coming, many people look to that and say, look, it's the signs of the times. No, Matthew 24 is talking about the destruction of the temple, and he's saying when you see all these things happening, get out, and that's just what the Christians were able to do before Titus came in and invaded Jerusalem and destroyed that city. So to me, these individuals, James is still saying, because again, James didn't know when Christ would return. Brother Woods, that's his viewpoint of this, is Brother Woods says that he thinks that he's talking about the return of Christ. Brother Woods has left this earth. He's gone on to his reward. But I guarantee you, when he was preaching, what was he saying? The same thing I'm saying. Christ could return any day. So I think that all follows suit with that when he's saying that the return of Christ could come at any time, it draws near, it could, right? It could be today. It could be this afternoon. Christ could return. None of us know that. It could be 2,000 more years that the earth is able to spend. We don't know that. So I think James is preaching the same sermon that Brother Woods has preached, that I have preached, that we don't know when the Lord cometh. So he says, be patient. You don't know when the Lord is going to return. Now, if you are of the mindset that this is talking, he's referring to the destruction of Jerusalem, I think there's some evidence for that, but I think the evidence that points that these Christians scattered abroad really don't line up with it being Jerusalem. Interesting note, if you're of the mind, I don't know how many of you date the Revelation. You may I don't care when the date. You may not have thought much about the date of Revelation, but that's Brother Cates's argument for the Revelation being before AD 70, is because you have these churches up here in Asia Minor weren't really affiliated. The temple in Jerusalem didn't really have that big of an impact as far as being a Christian, because the churches were out here. The church wasn't at the temple there in Jerusalem. They didn't have to go perform the sacrifices. They didn't have to go there to worship. They did just like we are doing today. So that's kind of his argument for the AD 90 writing in Jerusalem, or for Revelation, because it wouldn't make that big of a difference to the Christians about Jerusalem, though it would have made an impact, obviously, but not like what we might think about. All right, so maybe that's given you plenty to think about this morning. Now, notice here what he's getting at. Be patient, right? Be calm in the face of all these things. Again, be patient, establish in your heart, just be confirmed in your heart. But notice here in verse 9, grudge not one another, or grudge not one against another, brethren, lest ye be condemned. Behold, the judge standeth at the door. So here we see that phrase again, the judge, being Christ, the judge stands at the door. So this grudging would be discontent or complaining about things. They're murmuring. I think the ASV has murmuring, and some other translations may have murmur. But notice, if I'm murmuring against another, again, as far as Christians, if I'm complaining, if I'm murmuring, lest ye be condemned. So the idea of being condemned is pronounce a sentence after determination of guilt. Pronounce a sentence on, so that we might not be under sentence together with the world. Now I think this is where James is getting to. He's saying, you're oppressed, you're going through a lot of things, just be patient. All right? Be calm during these things. Don't find yourself murmuring and complaining and speaking out against these things, because the day of the Lord is coming, right? And at the day of the Lord, the judgment's going to be set, and we don't want to find ourselves condemned like these individuals that we're murmuring against. So that's a good lesson for us as Christians today, that we take those thoughts and think, all right, I don't want to, we don't want to be doing too much like the world, in the sense that we say, all right, I understand at the judgment day that the world will get that judgment against them. I don't want to find myself in that same position because of something that I had been doing, right? So murmuring against them. So, again, the idea of the judge standing at the door, being Christ before the door. Right there, he is near. He is in a position to enter suddenly and unexpectedly, and ready to accomplish his purpose without delay. And that's what Brother Bob Winton had to say about that verse, with the idea, you don't know if tomorrow Jesus is going to return. You don't know if he's going to return today. You don't know if it may be 100 years from now, but you don't know that it's not tomorrow. So don't be complaining and murmuring to the point that you find yourself condemned just like the world, because he might come back tomorrow. So again, that's kind of a view that James is speaking about that. That's the view Brother Woods has. That's the view I'm holding, in that it's talking about the coming judgment there of God, or of Jesus, and in the judgment day. All right, so how do we go through and do this, right? I don't know how many of you maybe have been afflicted at work, maybe looked at it and think, man, this is difficult going through this. I can't stand this place, kind of those mindsets, maybe going through some difficulties, being oppressed. We don't really get oppressed as Christians. We may be oppressed as Christians, but not because we are Christians normally in today's society. But let's look at these examples. James chapter 5 and verse 10, take my brethren the prophets, who have spoken in the name of the Lord, for an example of suffering, affliction, and of patience. So, James, how am I going to get through this, right? You're telling me to be patient while I'm being oppressed. I've got to be pure. I can't be murmuring and complaining. How do I do that? I've got to look at the prophets. All right, whoops, heavy hand there. So again, the idea of the affliction that these people are going to suffer, suffering misfortune, bear hardship patiently, and then the patience is the state of remaining tranquil. Again, the same patience that we saw earlier while awaiting an outcome, patience, steadfastness, endurance. So they were able to do this. Now, what's interesting there, okay, that's the next verse. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So, as an example, Christians, look at the prophets. Look at what they were going through and look what they had to suffer, and they were able to stay strong and they were able to go through these things. So when I'm having to bear this type of hardship, I just need to think about the prophets. Now, if you have some trouble doing that, let me encourage you to go to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, the great roll call of faith or roll call of obedience. But notice what some of these individuals had to go through, and I think about these sometimes when you think, oh, I've got it so bad. I've done the same thing. I'm not pointing fingers. We've had it before. Like, oh, it's just so tough. Hebrews chapter 11, look at verse 32. And what shall I say? What shall I more say? For the time shall fail me to tell of Gideon, and of Barak, and Samson, and Jephthah, and David, and also Samuel, and of the prophets. All right, so here's what we're talking about. Who through faith subdued kingdoms, they wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions. Hebrews 11:34, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword. Out of weakness were made strong. They waxed valiant in fight, turned to fight the armies of the aliens. Interesting, we find that word again. Women received their dead raised to life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover of bonds and imprisonment. And they were stoned, and they were sawn asunder, and were tempted, and were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented. And I love this verse, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And these all, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise. So these prophets were going through all of this, and they didn't have the New Testament like we have today. Where today we see from the beginning to the end, and we're kind of living in that moment, the prophets, they were talking about all of this that we're getting to enjoy today, and they were going through all of that, but they still remained faithful, they still remained strong. So when we think about those individuals going through that, the suffering, we're saying, all right, they did it, I can do it. All right, we need to follow through with that. All right, closing out here. Here's the verse I was looking for. Verse 11, James chapter 5, going back to that. Behold, we count them happy which endure. We have heard of the patience of Job, and have seen the end of the Lord, that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy. So, notice this phrase, happy. We count them happy. All right, so I don't know about you, but when I'm going through those endurances, consider them happy. And the way that is used in the Greek, to call or consider someone especially favored, called, considered, blessed, happy, fortunate. So as we just read in Hebrews 11, those individuals that were going through all that, he says, behold, we count them happy, which endure. So those people who are going through those hardships, and again, the idea of enduring is to maintain a belief or course of action in the face of opposition, stand one's ground, hold out, and endure. So when we see individuals, and again, kind of bringing it back to today, when we see individuals who face losing loved ones, lose family members, lose friends, lose jobs, lose houses, sometimes it seems like some of those individuals just get it all at one time. but they're still faithful, right? They still endure. They still go. I can't help but think about my cousin. He farmed over in Savannah, and a tornado came through and destroyed a whole lot of his equipment and his sheds and different things. And, my grandmother was asking him, they said, you gonna sell out? He said, no, that's just part of it. And then I think some of his cattle had gotten sick and had a bad run of that. He said, I'm just going to keep hanging in there. So I admire him for that, because I probably would have sold out. But he hangs in there. He says, I'm going to endure. So as Christians, right, it's strengthening when we see people like that. When bad things happen to good people, again, look at Job. And that's kind of what he's getting at with this idea of when we look at Job and what he had to do, the patience of Job. That's a great, maybe one of these days we'll get to study him and what's going on. But what Job teaches us is that even the righteous suffer difficulty. So if we're here this morning and we say, I'm a good, faithful Christian, why am I having to go through this? Well, Job had to go through that, right? Job had to face through those things. He was patient. The prophets were patient. We can be patient. And we consider them fortunate having to go through this and that they endured all of this. So it also teaches us, again, the book of Job, when we read about him, that the righteous, if you're righteous, you do not forsake God even when these things happen. So when bad times come, we can get through it. It's not because I'm wicked or righteous. And I understand that if I'm righteous, right, if I can endure, I must stay true to God as I go through this. So those are some good, again, James is easy to read, but hard to follow. That I've got to be patient. I can't murmur. I like to complain sometimes, right? Brittany gets an earful of it a lot of times. I like to complain. But I can't do that. I got to do better about complaining, because I say, all right, I don't want to be in the same condemnation as the world, because Jesus could come back at any time. Now, there's God being pitiful, and the Lord is very pitiful and tender mercy. He's got a high degree of affection and compassion. He is that way. He's concerned about another's unfortunate state or misery. So God, He sees what we're going through, right? So as we go through this, God's not saying, well, Ben, you did this bad thing, so here you go. No, He sees the way the world unfolds, and through that, He says, we know that the Lord is very compassionate to me, and that He is concerned about my misfortunes. And again, as we talked about this morning, only if I'm of that citizenship, right? Only if I'm His child and His son, or his son, He is my Father in heaven, that He is concerned about me versus being outside of that citizenship. Now, verse 12. Again, this is kind of thrown in there. I'm just going to go ahead and I'll tell you kind of why I put it in there. He says, but above all these things, so above all of this, Christians, my brethren, swear not, neither by heaven nor by earth, neither by any other oath, but let your yea be yea and your nay be nay, lest ye fall into condemnation. So because there's a fear of falling into condemnation is why I added this verse in with this section, even though it kind of seems out of place. But when you go to Matthew chapter 5, 33 through 37, we don't have time to read it, but I'll leave it up there so you can jot that down. When you hear Christ speaking on the Sermon on the Mount, He uses the very same language there, that we're not to swear by these things. So the idea of the swearing is to take an oath. I think you can, and maybe I'm reading too much into that, is we don't want to, if we're murmuring and we're complaining about our jobs, we don't want to take an oath against something concerning that, because we may fall into condemnation if we're doing those things, and we don't want to fall in, I think that's the same condemnation. The condemned, I should have done a better job of that. The condemnation there, that we don't want to fall into that. The condemnation is create a public expression that is at odds with one's real purpose or motivations. So I don't want to kind of run my mouth and say something as an oath if I'm not going to fulfill that, because there's great danger in doing those things. Again, Christ speaks about that. We need to do that. We need to be mindful of that even today. There's condemnation. If you want to look those words up, you can fall to experience loss of status or condition. So we don't want to belittle ourselves in that we make these great oaths. I think maybe in the context of being oppressed, and then we find ourselves falling into that condemnation with that. All right, so we got the top of the hour there. I'll just go ahead and leave that up. That'll be the song that Drew will come and lead us. Any questions or comments so far there through James chapter 5, there 7 through 12? Wonderful. All right. we'll be finishing out James, like I said, Lord willing, in the next 2 Sundays, and then we'll be moving on to 1 Peter. So I would encourage you to maybe be reading ahead into 1 Peter, some of the stuff. If you have some questions, hopefully we can get those addressed for you during the class. So thankful for everybody being here. Again, great encouragement to see you this morning. So Drew will